When we look at the nexus between nuclear power production and nuclear proliferation of nuclear weapons, we are cognizant that we need to control the flow of materials and technology. So at a high level, the technology similarities between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons is relatively limited. To have the knowledge to build a nuclear power plant for commercial power production, there's only some overlap with the same technologies that you need to build a nuclear warhead. The common area is really in the materials. Most uranium that we find is about 99% uranium-238, and that is a non-fissile isotope of uranium. The fissile isotope U-235 is the isotope that causes a chain reaction that you use either for nuclear power or for nuclear fission in a weapon. And so when we look at how we take this raw material that's primarily uranium-238 and turn it into something that we can use, there's really two processes. First, there's enrichment. And in enrichment, we use a number of different methods to raise that percentage of uranium-235 to a level that we can use. Now, low enriched uranium, which is what we use for commercial power production, is between 0 and 20% uranium-235. For most power plants today, that's about 3 to 5% uranium-235. And then when we actually get to weapons, to be able to have a weapon that has a sufficient amount of uranium-235, you actually need to have about 90% or more. So that enrichment process and the control of materials that you would put into that enrichment process, that's really where one of the main nexuses is between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Beyond that, there's also what's called reprocessing. When you run a nuclear reactor, you produce plutonium, and plutonium is a fissile isotope that, along with uranium-235, you can have a sustained chain reaction. And so when we're producing plutonium for nuclear weapons, we're using a nuclear reactor to do that, but it's not a simple process of taking plutonium out of the reactor. There's a bunch of other things that are produced during the fissioning of uranium-235 that we have to process out. And so to get that plutonium, we use reprocessing technologies. Now we can use reprocessing on the commercial side to close the fuel cycle, and we can reuse some of the uranium or even the plutonium for commercial power production. But that plutonium-239 that we produce as part of reprocessing can also be used in a weapon relatively easily. And so if we're looking at non-proliferation and how to control that, we control the materials, we control the enrichment, and we control the reprocessing technologies. Those three things together are how we prevent nuclear weapons from developing from commercial energy. The concern would be if you have a country that might be interested in developing nuclear weapons in the future, developing enrichment and reprocessing facilities. And so when we look at how do we do the expansion of nuclear power to prevent proliferation, as a policy objective, we want to limit the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies to unstable areas or to regimes that we are concerned about.
Increased nuclear power should not mean increased nuclear enrichment capabilities around the world, because there's so much overcapacity already that it makes no commercial sense for countries to develop their own indigenous nuclear enrichment capabilities.
I don't foresee a huge increase in enrichment and reprocessing facilities around the world. This issue has been a point of contention between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states for decades. Non-nuclear weapon states have been arguing that they have the inalienable right to nuclear energy, peaceful use of nuclear energy. And in order to use nuclear energy, they have to secure a stable supply of nuclear fuels. The argument that nuclear non-weapon states have to have the indigenous ability to produce nuclear fuels is not gaining much support. And over time, the international community has established not binding rules, but norms against the spread and development of enrichment and reprocessing. And so now, if any state is determined to use and pursue enrichment and reprocessing, even though there is not that much concern about nuclear fuel supply, that raises a red flag. And then the Security Council can impose economic sanctions, and individual states like the United States can unilaterally impose sanctions. Nonetheless, some countries like North Korea and Iran have evaded sanctions and developed enrichment and reprocessing, but only at very high costs. And I don't think that many countries would want to replicate that experience of being an international pariah and also suffering huge economic costs. However, there are some countries that may pursue enrichment and reprocessing, with the most likely candidates being Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and possibly South Korea.
I think there's two strategies to follow when it comes to the potential for enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. Currently in the United States, we don't reprocess nuclear fuel. It's a once-through fuel cycle system, and once fuel rods are pulled out of their reactors, they basically sit in dry cask storage at the nuclear power sites until a national repository can be finalized. Other countries, including Russia, Japan, and most of Europe, use a multiple times through fuel cycle, and they will reprocess spent fuel rods into mixed oxide fuel. We have determined in this country that that's not a cost-effective method, and for us to do it now would cost possibly trillions of dollars. What this means is that the United States might end up outsourcing this type of fuel reprocessing to countries such as Russia, who already do it and do it pretty well. They have proposed with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, a series of international uranium enrichment centers where countries who wish to avail themselves of nuclear power in order to decarbonize their energy supply would basically rent nuclear fuel rods from the IAEA in Russia via these centers. They would be able to use them to produce energy, and when the energy is done, they would send them back. So the risks of proliferation are minimized to some degree, but proliferation is still a serious risk. When we talk about expanding nuclear energy, we're not just talking about reactors, we're talking about uranium mines, we're talking about processing and enrichment, facilities, shipping and transport, waste reprocessing and disposal. All of these points along the nuclear fuel chain are places where fissile material could be diverted.
The potential expansion in nuclear energy around the world, both, in my opinion, could or could not result in a corresponding increase in enrichment and plutonium reprocessing facilities. I think it all depends on how things shake out. We are at a point where things could really go off in so many different directions. It may always be the case that there are specific countries or specific governments that have those intentions and hedge towards weaponization. We have seen nations that could have expanded, not expand, and not cross into that realm. With an internationalized fuel cycle system, will countries, newcomer countries in particular, embrace a more multilateral system to keep costs down and in effect temper their national capabilities by doing so? That could certainly minimize the ability to hedge towards weapons capabilities. We should prepare for either reality. We should not be taken by surprise. And whichever way things go, we have the foresight and the ability to predict what could happen, and we should prepare as such.